Okay, so looking at this problem is multi-step. So we're gonna draw vertical line. So always, if it's an equal sign or an inequality sign, draw your vertical line. And then on each side, look to see if you can simplify it. So think of each side as like a expression. On the left-hand side, all we have is negative 25. There's nothing we can do. But on this right-hand side, I can look to see first if you can distribute, but there's no parentheses, so you can't do that. But you can combine like terms. And the two terms that I can combine are the 7x, but it's a negative 7x because of the sign in front. And I can combine that with negative 3x. So when I do that, everything comes down and the 1 drops down. But I'm going to go ahead and combine negative 7x minus 3x will give us negative 10x. Then we look, and 1 and negative 10x cannot be combined together. So now it's at a two-step equation. And the way, so I'm going to read it the way that I read it, and we can work backwards, but I also will try to explain, like, the furthest thing from your variable is what you should move. So the furthest thing from my x is the 1. That's what I got to move from one side to the other, and it's a positive 1. So the opposite would be negative 1. So if you see that, that's good. Or if I read it starting with x, knowing that there's a multiplication sign between it, I would read it as x times negative 10. So be careful with that because we always talk about keeping the sign in front. And then I would have to read it as plus 1 because it's a positive 1. So sometimes that's confusing on how do you read it. So the other thing you can think is the furthest thing from my x. I can do that. Another option is you could switch the order of it if that helps and put your negative 10x in front and put the 1 after it, knowing that you need some operation in front of it. So it's a positive 1. So let me know if you have questions on that. Once you figure that out, now it's just working backwards, doing the opposite. So like I said, the furthest thing from your x is the positive 1, so we have to subtract 1 from both sides. So positive 1 minus 1 equals 0. Negative 25 minus 1 will give us negative 26 equals negative 10x. And then the opposite of times negative 10 becomes divided by negative 10, changing the operation, but keeping the value the same. So it's a negative 10, so it's still going to be a negative 10. And we divide both sides by negative 10. Then you could get a decimal or a fraction answer. So as a decimal, our answer would be 2.6 equals, and then remember, negative 10 divided by negative 10 equals 1, but 1x is the same thing as just x. So this would be our answer. Or as a fraction, if we reduced negative 26 over negative 10, it would equal 13 over 5. Okay, so let's start going through this one. So we're going to start the same way every single time. So even though we have an inequality sign, we're still going to divide our equation in half. And the purpose of that is because we want to simplify each side as much as possible. So looking at the left-hand side, right away we should see we have parentheses. So if we have parentheses, we want to look and say, okay, do I have anything in front of there that I need to distribute? Right now, all I have is this minus sign. So you could distribute just the negative, but it's also good to know there's an imaginary 1 right next to the parentheses if there's not a number there. So if there's already a number there, like minus 5, then you would distribute the negative 5. So in this case, we're going to distribute negative 1 to everything inside the parentheses using multiplication. So 2y comes down. And then negative 1 times 3y will give us negative 3y. And then negative 1 times positive 4, I like to put that out in case it is a minus, would be negative 4. And so since we're simplifying, we don't have to think about our inequality sign right now. And in the same step, we could look and say, can we do anything to simplify this side? We can't, because 8y and 22 aren't like terms, so that will just stay the way it is. So I just bring all that down. Then we look at our next line. So on the left-hand side, we can still simplify further, and we can combine 2y with negative 3y. And that would give us negative 1y. And then our minus 4 just comes down. Okay, so now we have variables on both sides, and we want to move them to the same side. So I can't simplify anything more, but because I have a negative 1y on the left and an 8y on the right, I need to get them to the same side, but I can't just put it on the other side. I have to do the inverse operation. And like I said, I like to move the smaller number every single time. So negative 1 is smaller than positive 8. So I would add 1y. So negative 1 plus 1 equals 0. And then whatever I did to that side, I have to do the other side, lining it up with the like term. So 8y and 1y are like terms, which would then give us 9y. And then 22 comes down along with negative 4. So then now it's a two-step equation. So working backwards and opposite, or if we write it out, so I would read this as y times 9 plus 22. So then working backwards using inverse operations, the opposite of plus 22, or looking at the equation itself. So the 9y plus 22, the furthest thing from the y value is the 22. So the opposite would be to subtract 22. Whoops. And whatever we do to one side, we have to do to the other side. So we'll get negative 26. And then positive 22, negative 22 cancels, and then 9y comes down. And then just like we've talked about before, we're subtracting 22, so we don't do anything with the inequality sign. So it's going to stay the same. The only time that we need to like double check it is if we're multiplying or dividing. So like in this next step, we have y times 9. So the opposite would be to divide by 9. So as soon as we say division, we say, okay, let me double check. Am I dividing by a negative? I'm not. I'm dividing by a positive, so that does not affect my sign. If I was dividing by a negative 9, I would have to switch the direction of this sign. So because 9 is positive, I leave it the same direction. So then that's going to give us a decimal. I don't think that'll reduce. Here, let's just check it. So then keep in mind, just so you can remember on Desmos calculator, I would use the scientific calculator, and that link is posted throughout in power. So if we did negative 26 divided by 9, so it gives us negative 2.8 repeating, and then if I hit the little sign next to it, it'll switch it back, so it still is going to be negative 26 over 9. So keep in mind that button is there, and that's helpful for you, especially when you're taking the test. So then my final answer will just stay negative 26 over 9. And then keep in mind, because when we get like graphing this would be, you could estimate about where this would be graphed on a number line, right? Because it's negative 2.8 repeating. But if we were to graph and look at the inequality sign, we would flip the entire thing. So keep in mind that this would be the same as y is greater than negative 26 over 9. So the bigger opening stays towards like the variable or the value, depending on how it's set up. So you want to make sure that it's facing the same way, like, or if you flip the whole thing, you have to flip the sign as well. Let me zoom out a little bit. Draw a line. The first thing that you should know is that you need to distribute, and actually you have to distribute on both sides. So on the left, we would distribute and multiply this 6 by everything inside our parentheses. So this would become 12x minus 24, because we have to take the negative 4 when we multiply. And then we can go ahead and do the distribution on the right-hand side as well. So 4, remember there's multiplication between here. 4 times 3x would give us 12x. And then 4 times negative 5, whoops, would give us negative 20. Now with a problem like this, so now we can't combine like terms. So I need to move one of my variables. And usually I say move the smaller one, but in this case, they're exactly the same. So it does not matter. So the opposite of positive 12x is negative 12x. So 12x minus 12x equals 0. But I am subtracting 12x, so I have to do the same thing on the other side. Now again, 12x minus 12x equals 0. So you're like, what the heck? So you bring down the values that are left. So we have a negative 24 on the left, but on the right, we have a negative 20. Your variable disappears. So what's important with this is if your variable disappears and the two numbers are equal to each other, that means it's infinitely many solutions, because the numbers, like that means you can substitute any value into that original equation and it'll always be equal. Now, in this case, negative 24 equals negative 20. That's not true, right? Those are not equal to each other. So if that happens, this would be no solution. So they're not equal. So no solution. And if it was one solution, it would be like x equals 5 or y equals negative 2. That's one solution if it's a variable equals a number. So one more time, if the two numbers are equal, so negative 20 equals negative 20, that would be infinite solutions. If the two numbers are not equal, it's no solution. Any questions on that? So that's back. We talked about it when we did multi-step equations, but like I said, most of the time you get one solution. So I want to make sure we review this before the test. Let's do an inequality where we are then going to graph it as well, just to do one more review of that. Okay. So looking at this, starting the same way, We can't distribute, we can't combine like terms. So it's a two-step equation. We're going to work backwards. If I read it, the 6 and the x next to each other's multiplication, so it'd be x times -6 minus 12. I need to work backwards using inverse operations, which means opposites. So, or the furthest thing from my x is that -12. So the opposite of that would be to add 12 to both sides. Good, Xavier, except check your sign. So it's not an equal sign, which I know you can't type it in. Just make sure on your paper you have it. So -12 plus 12 equals 0. And then -6x. And then we're also going to graph this one on a number line. So if you got the answer and you want to try to graph it, make sure you know how to do that. Now, because we added, we don't do anything with our inequality sign. So we got, and then 12 plus 12 is 24. And then the opposite of times would be divide. But in this case, we're dividing by a -6. So anytime we multiply or divide, we say, okay, what am I dividing by? If it's a negative, flip the direction of the inequality. So because I'm dividing by -6, that means this inequality sign needs to flip the other direction. And then -6 divided by -6 equals 1, which would leave us with just x. And then 24 divided by -6 would give us -4. Now, if we want to graph that, the line underneath the inequality sign means equal to. So that means we use a filled in circle on -4. If there's no line underneath the inequality sign, so kind of like what we saw up here for problem number 2, if we were to graph that, we would have used an open circle because it's greater than or less than that -26/9, but it's not equal to it. So because it's equal to it, that means that 4 would be a possible, or -4 would be a possible solution. And then its x is less than or equal to -4, so we shade to the left. And the nice thing about you having examples is if you're not sure, look and find an example that's similar and try to figure it out that way as far as graphing it. Okay, so let's go through this. And again, usually we see these with equals, but inequalities, it doesn't matter. With this one, so it's hard to say like what is the furthest thing from my x, so that's why I say, especially for these ones with fractions, if you read them, it really helps. So if I read it, I would say x plus 2 divided by 10. The reason for that is if the way it's written can change the way I solve it. So then going backwards using inverses, the opposite of divide by 10 would mean I need to multiply by 10 on both sides. So let me just rewrite this down below. So then I can multiply by 10. The reason I'm multiplying by 10, I don't have to distribute that or anything. It's because times 10 and divided by 10 are inverses. So the point is so that those cancel out. And then I have to multiply the other side by 10 as well. So then I'm left with x plus 2 is greater than 50. Then from there, pretty straightforward, just a one-step equation. So the opposite of plus 2 would be to minus 2. which then leaves us with x, and I'm subtracting, so my inequality doesn't change. Just like above, when I times 10, it was a positive 10, so I didn't have to switch the inequality. If it was a negative, you'd want to flip the inequality sign. And then this leaves me with 48. And then just for the fun of it, let's graph it, because the more you do it, the better you become. So think in your head, would you use an open circle or a closed circle? There's no line underneath the inequality sign. So therefore, I'm going to use an open circle. So x is greater than 48. It does not include 48. So it's an open circle. And because it's greater than, you shade to the right. Okay, so let's start this one. It looks long and scary, but if we break it down into pieces, it's everything that we've learned throughout the year. So split our equation in half. And imagine if like the whole right side is gone and focus on one side. And you could do the whole one side, simplify it, and then go do the other side, or you can alternate back and forth like I will. But the first step always is to look to see if you can distribute. And on the left-hand side, we can. So be careful to, like 5 minus 8, that's a common thing that people will try to combine those first. And like we talked about this week, distribution is multiplication, so you have to multiply first. So always, always, always look to see if there's anything to distribute. In this case, we have a -8 that should get multiplied by everything inside the parentheses. So our 5 just comes down. And then -8 times 4 will give us -32. And -8 times -2 will give us a +16. Okay, then on the right-hand side, I'm going to do the same thing. So do I have anything to distribute? I do. In this case, I have a 7. So I'm going to distribute and multiply that by everything inside the parentheses. And then be careful because you do not distribute to the -14. That's outside the parentheses. So that's basically just drops down as well once we're finished. So 7 times 3y becomes 21y. And then 7 times 1 gives us +7. And then we bring down the -14. Okay. Then we look, after we distribute, can we combine like terms on either side? So on the left-hand side, the 5 minus 32 plus 16y, I can combine 5 with the -32 because those both don't have variables. And then that's going to give me -27. And then plus the 16y. And then on the right-hand side, again, there's nothing that has a y with it, but I can combine +7 with -14. So 21 comes down. Whoops. And then I get -7. So +7 minus 14 will give us a -7. So once you simplify that, you're back to having just variables on both sides. So similar to what we had in what problem? Like problems 1 and 2, or sorry, problems 2 and 3. So you could look back at that. So then from here, now we have to move one of the terms. So I like to move the smaller one. So between 16y and 21y, I'm going to move the 16. And so I have to do the inverse of +16 and subtract 16y. And then do the same thing on the other side with the like term. So those cancel. And then negative 27. Now, because we subtracted, the inequality sign is going to stay the same, less than or equal to. And then 21 minus 16 gives us 5y. And then the minus 7 comes down. And now we're back to two-step equations. So like that's why all the steps are important, because you go from like a complicated multi-step to multi-step with variables on both sides to a two-step equation and then so forth. So now if I read it, probably tired of me reading it, but it would be y times 5 minus 7. Work backwards, use inverse operations. So in this case, I'm going to add 7 to both sides. Negative 7 plus 7 equals 0. Negative 27 plus 7 leaves us with negative 20. And then we're adding, so the inequality sign stays the same. 5y drops down. Now our last step is we have times 5, so we need to do the opposite, and we're going to divide by 5. So inequalities, again, division, but it's a positive, so I do not need to switch the inequality sign. So I'm going to leave it the same. Oh, I forgot to do my division. So divide by 5. Divide by 5, but because it's a positive, I don't flip the inequality. And then negative 20 divided by 5 gives me negative 4. 5 divided by 5 is 1, which leaves me with just y. And then I want to graph this. So I can, if you know how to read it, it's pretty straightforward, but I want to point something out. So let me set this up. What? Not negative 2, negative 5. What am I doing? So again, the inequality sign is less than or equal to, well, it's actually, if we're reading it from y, it would be y is greater than or equal to, but the equal to is going to tell us that it's a filled in circle. So reading it from y, if you know and you can see that it's y is greater than or equal to, you know we should shade to the right. We've talked about that you can use the arrow to shade the direction that it should go, but that's only true if the variable is on the left-hand side. So right now it's on the right, so we can flip the entire thing like we talked about a little bit earlier. So this would be the same thing as y, and then I have to flip the inequality sign, is greater than or equal to negative 4. So now I can actually use the direction of the inequality sign to help me. See how it's pointing towards the right? But again, you can only do that, like only use the sign if the variable is on the left and comes first. So you can flip the whole thing. So that tells me shade to the right. So real quick, just to wrap up, if any of you, like after you watch this video, if you have any questions about any of the problems that you didn't understand something that I did, or if you're working through the review sheet and you have questions about particular like questions, like then send me the problem number and I'm happy to look at that, or take a picture of your work and send it to me, and then I can tell you specifically like where you have a mistake. And don't forget there's an answer key in Empower. So check your answer first. If it's right, then you're good. You know what you're doing. If it's not, then reach out, like I said, and we can talk through that before you take the unit test. Do your best and good luck.